Hi everybody. So I apologize for the low light yet again, and also I hope the sound's okay because I'm using the onboard for my camera. My phone, I guess, would be, yeah, camera, phone. I'm using the onboard mic instead of my headset, which I would normally use. So last time I talked about the eviction process in Ontario and beginning to end what happens when you receive an N5, the process of what the landlord has to go through to get you into court, what to expect when you get into court, how to find some legal help if you can't afford it, like most of us can't, how to prepare for the hearing, what happens in the hearing, and so on. So now I'm going to talk about what happens after you get your orders, after the hearing, okay? And one more time, this is not meant to be any kind of legal advice. If you have been served a notice, you have to please seek legal help. Get in touch with a paralegal who is familiar and well versed with the Landlord Tenant Board and the Residential Tenancies Act. Familiarize yourself with the Residential Tenancies Act because you'll be in a better position to explain what you want to your paralegal. Because unfortunately, when I was going through all the hassles I was going through, I talked to a lot of paralegals who really seemed to be on the side of the landlords, and so they were more interested in making deals than saying, no, this is wrong and maybe you shouldn't be evicting your tenants. But that's in the past. I mean, there's nothing that we can do about it now. So last time I also talked about what the service standards at the board say they're supposed to, what the timeline is supposed to look like. Today I'm going to tell you the timeline of my case. So my property manager filed in January of 2020. We received our first notice of a hearing, and that was going to be in May of 2020, so about 4 months, a little over 4 or 5 months. But then COVID hit, so our hearing got canceled. So our first case management hearing was in September of 2020, so we're at 9 months now. Well, I guess it'd be 8 months. Yeah, 8 months. And we were unable to come to any kind of agreement because the landlord wanted it that way, I wanted it that way. Too bad, so sad. So they rescheduled for a merits hearing. That happened in March of 2021. So now we're at 14 months after filing. In the meantime, I filed a T2, which was a complaint about my landlord, primarily the harassment that came from the broken windows, serving me notice without wearing a mask, and keeping tabs on my comings and goings, which is highly inappropriate. So I filed that in February of 2021, and I had asked if we could change the date so that we could hold both the hearings together, but the landlord wouldn't go for that. And if you want to do something like that, again, you can sometimes buy yourself a little bit more time. The landlord has to agree to it if you want to change the court date. So my merits hearing was in March of 2021. For my T2, my case management hearing was in May of 2021, and my case management hearing was either May or June of 2021, and then my merits hearing was in November of 2021 for my T2. Now, as you see, we're at a year and 10 months now, still waiting for orders, and it actually took 10 months from my landlord's filing for the eviction, the L2. It took 10 months to get our orders from March of 2021 all the way up until June 10th of 2022, or 2022. So we're now at 2 full years to get orders. So then what happens after you get your orders? Now, as I said before, the first time there's a problem, the landlord-tenant board tries to come to agreement and sort of mediate what's going on between you and your landlord, and they want to give the tenant a chance to stay. So, but I even, tried to work it out and said, how about you drop the case and we'll do whatever. She said, only if I can have a Section 78, which by the way is completely illegal. You can't have a Section 78 without an order from the board. And I was like, no, let's just take it to court then. So the landlord's case against me was dismissed, and they said, you have to follow these conditions, on the condition that you do this, this, and this. And if you don't follow the order, then under the Section 78, the landlord can apply to evict you. Okay. So, coincidentally, not. We received, so I had, we had done my T2 case, had the hearing in November, and then I received my orders in May. Exactly 30 days after we got my orders, property manager pulls another inspection and we go back to court. So the way that it works when you get your orders, and then okay, so like I said, we're at 2.5 full years now. So if you have an order and you violate that order under Section 78, the landlord can file for what's called an ex parte order, again, which means you don't have to go back to court. And then the landlord-tenant board can either say, we agree, and order the eviction, or they can say, well, we don't agree that there was a breach. Let's go back to court again. So we got another court date. Now that's called an L4 hearing. So the procedure for that, again, is the same. The landlord files, we get a court date, we all file our evidence, and then we go to the hearing, the board decides. I'll talk about that in just a minute. I mean, there's not a whole lot to talk about, but we had our first hearing. I'm trying to remember when the first hearing was. I think it was sometime around October-ish, and that ended up getting remanded 3 more times. And then our final court hearing was July 14th of 2023. So we're now 3.5 years into this process. And then another 4 months passed. And I got my eviction order in November of 2023. The original eviction date was January 31st, 2024. So again, we're 4 full years after my landlord first filed. January 20th was the day that the 21st was the day that she filed. And then there's still, and then I applied for more time because I told them, they said, well, you didn't have a doctor's note. So I brought a doctor's note. And because I had active cellulitis in my leg, I brought a doctor's note that said, if Celine has to live in her car and be homeless with active cellulitis, she could die or lose her leg. But that still wasn't enough for the board. They don't care. And that's yet another reason that my opinion is that the board is just not on the side of tenants. So the final move-out date was February, so they gave me 4 more weeks. Isn't that big of them? I really just wanted a couple more months so that I could move out in a warm month, but they weren't having it. Because I told them, if I'm living in my car, I'd rather live in my car in April or May than in January in Ontario. But they gave me 4 more weeks, and then the sheriff came. So my final move out date was March 29th. So I'll talk about that process. I just wanted to give you an idea of what the timeline ended up being for my court case. So it took fully 4 years and 2 months was the timeline. From January 21st was the day that she filed the L2, and March 29th, 2024 was the move out date. So that's one of the reasons that I think I'm pretty convinced that Chantal was not evicted because the eviction process in Ontario is long. Now, what happened with me is probably not typical of most court cases, but a lot of them do go 2 years or more. Last I heard, and it's been a while, the board they were prioritizing non-payment of rent cases, and they were taking between 3 and 6 months to order, to schedule, that's what I'm looking for, to schedule the hearings. But there were a few people that I saw that they had like 2 weeks. It was crazy how quick they got a hearing. So there had to have been something else going on there. Now, again, there is a process where you can appeal. You can either appeal and have a review of the orders if you think that there was a legal issue. You can't just appeal it because you don't agree with the decision. And you have to file within 30 days of receiving your orders. Now, one of the things that makes that difficult is that you have to apply for a recording from the board and then submit that with your request. And in order to apply for the hearing, to get the recording of the hearing, first you have to go to this website, pay them, and then email them with your receipt, and then fill out another form and show that you paid for the recording. And that can take a couple of weeks. And then it's another, I can't remember exactly how long it was, but it was like almost 2 weeks. So we filed like on day 29 for a review. So the other thing that you can do if you file within 10 days of receiving your orders is you can just file a request for more time, under hardship, under, just the simple fact that it is really, really hard to find an affordable place, and so on. Sometimes they'll grant it, sometimes they won't. Okay. So let's go back to the day you get your order. So first thing you do is cry. First thing you wonder how that could have possibly gone through, because this whole case was bullshit. Then the next thing you do is you try to figure out what your options are. So if you are evicted because you didn't pay the rent, you can file, you can pay what you owe and just go from there. And then it'll be probably another Section 78. I should go back to the, you know what I forgot to do is I forgot to go to the ex parte part of the hearing part. Okay, so the first orders that we got, the case was dismissed with the sort of caveat that I have to clean up my act and not do what they were accusing me of doing, which was all bullshit. And otherwise, the landlord can file for Section 78, and she can file for an ex parte order. Now, the one thing that is really important is if you get an ex parte order, you have to file for that to be lifted within 10 days of getting it. And again, there are only specific reasons that they'll put a stop on that. Otherwise, the eviction, if the landlord tenant board decides that yes, the ex parte order should go through, then the sheriff's coming and you're evicted. A lot of the time that happens when you had an arranged agreement to pay what you owe and you didn't pay, or you were late with your rent again, or if you have already agreed that you're going to move out and you don't move out. That's more often what happens than just, you didn't pick up the dog poop one more time and the landlord decided that they were going to file again. So, but you can only set aside an ex parte order once. So if the board agrees to set aside the ex parte order, your original order goes back into play. Or I can't remember. Oh, you know what? I can't remember if the original order goes back or if there's a new order for another year. Something like that happens. But they'll issue orders, and this is all on Canly. You can look it up. I'm not quite as familiar with the setting aside the ex parte process. And again, if you do have something like this, definitely seek legal help. I'm just kind of going over all the options of what happens after you get your orders from the board. So when my landlord decided there was a breach, they filed for an ex parte order, and the LTB decided that no, she hasn't properly proven that there was a breach, so we're going to go back to court. So again, the same process happened. We received a court date, and then I went onto the portal, and by this time I already had my PIN, so I just was able to connect my account to my the number on the orders, or not the orders, the case number, sorry. So they give you a case number when they give you a court date. And again, I filed for I called the pro bono hotline, I signed up with the Tenant duty counsel, and this time I actually lucked out and got some help from a lawyer. And then during the ex parte, or during the process, this was even funnier. Again, the landlord just messed up. I mean, she gave my private information to another organization without my consent, which is illegal. And she lied on her application, which I tried to point out during the hearing, but the adjudicator wouldn't even hear it. Again, illegal. It flat out says in the Residential Tenancies Act that it is an offense to put false or misleading information into court documents. But the best part was that she brought a witness to all the goings on. So somebody that used to live in the building, that I'd had one conversation with this person in the 4 years that she lived in the building, and she'd never set foot in my apartment. I didn't even know her name for years. And I only learned it like a year before she left. So how this person is a witness to anything, I don't know. But it was awesome when my landlord, goes trotting her out. Oh, well, this is so-and-so, she's my witness. And the adjudicator says, well, how long did you live in the building? I lived there 4 years. I moved out in March of 2022. And he says, you're dismissed. And I'm over here going, watch me twerk. So that was one little tiny victory I got there, was her star witness. It wasn't even there the day of the breach in June. Anyway, I'm sort of babbling at this point. So the same thing happened. I submitted my evidence within 7 days of the hearing date. The landlord submitted theirs. Absolute crockery. And then we went back to a hearing, but the hearing got cut short, and we ended up going back to court. I don't even remember how many times we went to court, but it took an entire year to get through the L4 hearings. So the first hearing was she filed in June of 2022. The first hearing was in October, and the final hearing wasn't until July 14th of 2023. And then, okay, so then, again, once you've been through your final hearing, you wait, and the eviction order came in November of 2023. So then what happens when you have an actual eviction order? As I said, you can apply for a review if you think that there's been a breach of legal reasoning, or you can apply for more time. And I requested both. They listened to it, they determined that no, there was no breach. And then about a month later, and it was like right under the wire too. No, it was more than a month later. It was getting to be quite late in January when I finally got the order that I could have 4 more weeks. Again, isn't that big of them? You could live in your car in February instead of in January. So once the order's final, that's it. You have to move out. There's not really much you can do about it. But you still have a little bit more time because the landlord can't make you leave. The landlord-tenant board can order it, but they cannot enforce it. And that goes also for money that you owe or anything like that. So what happens once you have your orders is you're expected, you got to move out. So you do the cleaning and the packing, and you know what? If you get an eviction order, even if you get an N5, start packing now because you have 20 times as much stuff as you think you have. Trust me on that one. I mean, if you have it all packed up, you can unpack it later. But remember I told you there was a CBC video, and they were talking about how if you've been in a place longer than 5 years, there's a target on your back because landlords want to get you out and get somebody else in because the rents have just gone crazy. And they talked to this one guy, and everything he had was packed into bins so that he could make a quick getaway if he needed to. And in some eviction cases, all they give you is 10 days from the hearing date to the eviction date. Now, I got 2 months, so it could be up to 60 days, but they don't give you a lot of time once they decide, it's time for you to leave. So then what happens, back to what I was saying, the board can order the eviction, but they cannot enforce it. That's the sheriff that enforces it. So when the date comes and goes, the next day the landlord can go to the sheriff and request that they escort you out. And then what happens is the sheriff contacts you. They're supposed to send you a letter, but they don't always. Sometimes they just come and they put a notice on your door. And likewise, the timing varies depending on how busy the sheriff is. Now, there was during COVID, there was a moratorium on evictions in Ontario, and even for a couple of years after that, the sheriffs were stupidly busy. So it can be anywhere from 24 hours to a couple of weeks. Now, my move out date was February 28th, but I didn't hear from the sheriff for a couple of weeks, and the date that he gave me was March 22nd. So what happens on your actual move out date? You have to make sure you're ready to go. The sheriff comes and knocks on the door, and you have 5 minutes to get your stuff. Medications, pets, anything you're going to take with you immediately. It's best if you have some place to go arranged. So the sheriff comes and knocks on your door, and that's it. It's time for you to leave. As you're leaving, and then the sheriff waits while your landlord changes the locks, because it's up to the landlord to change the locks. Now, once the landlord does that, you have to arrange with the landlord, and you have 72 hours. Now, for a long time, there was some contention as to what 72 hours means, because you have to be there usually with an escort, and you're only usually allowed to go in between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. So there was some contention that because there's only 12 hours, 8 to 8, you could drag it out over 6 days, but that's not true. That's not correct. The sheriff told me himself, you have a flat 72 hours. So if he comes at 8 o'clock on Friday morning, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, you have until 7:59 a.m. on Monday to be gone. And that is also something that you need to arrange with your landlord. Now, in this case, we were a little bit luckier because we still had a lot of stuff to sort through, and my landlord just didn't want to deal with it. So she said, okay, I'll leave the door unlocked, come back and get your stuff, and do as much as you can. So we actually ended up taking another week from the move out date of March 22nd. We were gone March 29th. And after that, if you go back to the property, you're trespassing. And there's a big sign on the sheriff will leave a big sign on the door because they like the public humiliation ritual. That's part of the whole eviction process. But yeah, and you're not supposed to take it down for the amount of time is written on the notice. I think it's something like 24 hours, but I went back and I just ripped it off the door. I mean, it's not like the neighbors haven't seen it. It's not like the neighbors didn't see and hear all the big to-dos going on. And there's nothing that says that the landlord can't come in while you're trying to pack and get out of there. They even had the audacity to say, oh, well, we're going to send somebody around to come in there and measure the windows. And I said, okay, first of all, you've measured the windows 5 times in the last 7 years. It's not like they've grown or shrank at all. Did they not write it down? And second, there's no space for him. He cannot get through to the windows. Why don't you leave me in peace to pack? Oh, well, I need to order them now for spring. And I'm like, order them in spring then, because you're at most going to be 6 months. And we got in this huge argument, and they ended up calling the cops. And I said to the cop, yeah, there is no space for that guy to go in there. And he's like, well, they're supposed to be allowed. And I said, okay, you know what? The window guy can come in, landlord cannot. No, leave me in peace to pack. What's she going to do? Evict me? So anyway, yeah. And that was another thing that, I mean, by the time you're even halfway through the eviction process, there's an absolute communication breakdown with the landlord. You just don't want to talk to each other. You don't want to be reasonable. You get in screaming matches. It's ridiculous. So yeah, that is the entire process beginning to end, from being served with notice to the date that you have to move out. After that, the only other thing to know is that the landlord, if the landlord thinks that you owe any kind of damages, now in Ontario, another thing that's illegal is to charge you a damage deposit before you move in. The only thing that it's legal for them to charge, they can't ask for a pet deposit either. The only thing that it's legal for them to charge as a deposit is your last month's rent. So they can only ask for last month's rent, and then they ask for first month's rent, which you pay when you move in. And that's the only legal way to do it. Now in Ontario, because the rents are so crazy, a lot of people are, paying an entire year's rent up front just because there's so much competition. But it's illegal for a landlord to ask for that. If you offer it, it's a different thing. And they're also allowed to charge a key deposit, but only if it's refundable and only in the amount to get a new key. So where was I going with that? Yeah, so if they believe that you owe them damages or you owe them money or something like that, then they have to file with the board. They can file for damages, they can file for monies owed, and they have 1 year from your move out date to do that. Because it's been more than a year, that's why I feel comfortable talking about this now, whereas 6 months ago I would not have, because I was still waiting to see if they were going to file anything else against me. The other thing about the landlord, though, is I mean, I'm homeless and jobless, and I told her flat out, I said, look, I'm homeless and jobless. I'm homeless and I could be on, I'm not well, I could be on ODSP by the time any of this goes through. Don't even bother trying to come after me for anything, because you're not going to get anything. Full stop. And that's another thing about the landlord-tenant board. I don't recommend this, but they can order you to pay if you owe rent or you owe damages, but again, they cannot enforce it. So if they go back to the landlord-tenant board court within a year after you have to leave, then they have to take the order from the court, from the landlord-tenant board, and then they have to go to small claims court to try and recoup the money. So that's another, could be up to 4 years in court with your landlord. So yeah, getting in trouble with the landlord it's going to be many years off your life. And at this point, living in a van might actually be, a little bit less stress. And I mean, on top of the 4 years of actual court dates, the harassment started in late 2016. So they harassed me for 3 years before they ever filed. And I got notices and notices, and then they would let it go, and then more notices, and then accusations and bullshit, and it was just an absolute madhouse living there. And in all honesty, if I had a time machine, I could go back. I would go back to 2014 when that property management company took over and move out. Go live in my van then. 10 years younger and a little bit better off, right? So I think that's everything. I'll put, again, the links in the doobly-doo. If there's any questions that you want me to answer about that process and what I went through, you can contact me. You can put it in the doobly-doo, or I hope that this was informative for you. I hope I didn't get too ranty or complainy. I have a little bit of a problem with that, but thank you for listening and sticking with me this far, and have a great day.